I would put statues of these sort of FinTech founders and successes. I'd put statues of them around the city, in Parliament Square. We need to properly fall back in love with people who take risk and create wealth. 1 in 6 young people now in this country are unemployed. They're actively looking for a job and they cannot find one.
If there was one Labour member of Parliament you could poach, who would it be?
Whoa, God, that's a difficult question.
So welcome to the Policy Fix. I'm Steve Rigby, Chief Executive of Rigby Group, one of the UK's largest private businesses. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Andrew Griffith, previously of Sky, where he was CFO and Chief Operating Officer, before stepping into the Conservative government in 2019, including being City Minister, and today is Shadow Business and Trade Secretary. So today Andrew and I are going to talk about a whole variety of issues, but importantly, how does the UK get its mojo back? How do we get business to engage effectively with government? How do we make sure that the wealth creators stay in these shores and help make the country prosperous? And stick around to the end of the podcast to hear Andrew's quickfire questions around who he might think is capable on the global stage of running the UK economy. So Andrew, welcome to the Policy Fix.
Delighted to be here. Thanks, Steve.
So you are a rare exception in Westminster in the fact you've had a really amazing career in business, which is certainly in the current administration quite a rare thing. And the Conservatives, just give us a little bit of background about that starting point of your career and the journey that you went on.
Oh, look, it was amazing. When I joined Sky, it was a disruptive startup. It'll be very hard for your viewers to remember that now. It's sort of almost beyond incumbent. But in those days, it was radical. Many people thought it would fail. It was a British business that invested lots of money for a very long period of time. So, when people often talk about the stock market not backing long-term successes, in those days, we had both ARM and BSkyB as companies that were getting the backing from the UK stock market. An amazing collection of people to work with. I worked with some fantastic executives. And the one thing I learned, Steve, which you will know, but I had to learn it, was always about the team. I mean, I'm so proud of the team that sort of I groomed and left behind. They're all running off and either running businesses or being big CFOs now. But you get results, a little bit different from Westminster. Sometimes you get results by working together as a team. And it was just a great journey.
So one of the most successful shows on Sky was Succession, based on the Murdochs. So as you know, I'm a strong believer in family businesses. But what was it like working for the Murdochs? And did you feel like a family business as well as a FTSE 100, or was it just a FTSE 100 organisation?
No, it was it was different. I mean, it had that 40% stake from the family, if you like, and that was a really good sea anchor. So when you were looking at making longer term investments, and you got a bit finance director, you're a bit nervous about going to the market and saying, look, we've got another investment curve. It'll be bigger and larger and more valuable at the end, but we're going to have to take a little bit of a gulp. Then you had that sense of the family looking long-term, managing long-term, and really supporting you as an executive. Now, of course, you had to deliver, right? That goes without saying, but they were very supportive. And as a family, I don't want to get too much into the psychology of it all, but all really high achieving. I worked with Elizabeth and James and Lachlan and, of course, Rupert when I joined. And people that think big, almost limitless possibilities.
Yes.
It's always, could you go faster? How do we make this opportunity even bigger? So a very, a really good way of thinking about business.
Yeah, Elizabeth built a big business, didn't she, herself? I think 400 million she sold a business for.
Yeah, correct.
Shine.
Yeah, correct.
And what's your current view on ITV and the potential acquisition by Sky? Is that just normal course of business that business has to consolidate? Is it more US takeover of British assets? Where do you sit on that debate?
If I'm honest, I'm super frustrated, and it often comes back to the regulators. I don't criticise people for the sake of it, but you think about the UK, right? The English language, the home of filmmaking, one of the earliest countries into television. And we've never really spawned an international success, right? ITV or the BBC could have been, or Sky, could have been a really big global success. And in many ways, we were often held back by the regulators looking inwards. So I argued, when I was in number 10, I argued very strongly that Channel 4 should consolidate with either ITV or the BBC or Sky to create a bit more scale, so we're able to compete on a more global footing. The English language is spoken is the second language of 2 billion people on this planet. It's the most often spoken second language. People around the world, in all sorts of continents are consuming English language content. Bridgerton, is huge. I don't watch it, but it's a huge export. Creative industries are huge, and we have not really dominated that industry in the way that we could had we looked at a global footprint rather than through a domestic lens. So, sorry, long answer to your question. I think we should allow that to happen. I think in the context of competing internationally, the most important thing is the commitment to British talent being based in Britain, benefiting from the craft industry that we have, a very long tail of craft industry in the sector, and focus on how do we do that.
I think, certain industries, certainly television is one of those industries, is under substantial change. I agree that we do often overregulate. So if I look at the mobile telephone business, our average bill, I'm talking dollar terms, is about $35 per month. In the US, it's nearer 80. And we've regulated down to having now quite a poor service. We can look at the water industry. Again, we can talk about fat cats and returns for private equity, but you and I both know getting a 10 or 11% return from a private capital perspective is quite normalised. It's not someone getting rich on the back of consumers, but the issue is simply the regulators not allowed the industry to make enough investment. So, is that a challenge?
Yeah, we need a hard rain coming for the regulatory state. Kemi's talked about that. I talk about that a lot. Not because they're bad people, but the incentives on regulators are always to find problems. That's the way you grow your empire. And secondly, always to be risk averse. That's the way you don't get criticised. And so if you create that system, and I'm a big fan of Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's business partner, who said, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. And the incentives that we create drive exactly that. Look at the cost of water. It's not very fashionable, but a price on average paid by a household for all of their unlimitless clean water and all of their sewage taken away will be less than the price of buying this, right? If you look at the mobile phone industry, it drove, for whatever reason, mobile phone operators to go and plug Chinese kit into the heart of their network because it was the cheapest. And we still have a real problem across most of our UK infrastructure with resilience. Right now, I think we should be on a war footing from a resilience perspective. How long does a mobile phone signal last in a power outage? How secure is our energy grid? But if all you do is look at it through the one particular lens, you'll end up with sort of where we are, Steve, which is we don't have good quality infrastructure. Yes, occasionally consumer prices are cheap, but then you'll pay a price in the long term, just as we've seen with the energy price shocks. You pay a price for having a particular fixation on particular policies.
So if we look today at the government with Labour, many positives, I'm sure, in what they're trying to achieve. But one thing they haven't necessarily brought into their organisation is business experience. So the majority of the ministers today haven't got a business background. I look at the other side with Reform, who are talking about a sort of US Trumpian style approach to bringing business everywhere. You know that business and government are clearly very different. So yes, there are some common learnings, but ultimately, they are different beasts. What is the right balance between business operating in a supportive way in government or trying to incentivize business people into government? What's the right model in your mind?
Look, first of all, you've got to be realistic about how concentrated government is. So all governments like bringing in some people, that sort of slightly they push out to show that they're interested, but they're not around the cabinet table. So around the cabinet, there is less actual business experience than an intern in the House of Commons gift shop. So you've got to fix that. You've got to have business around the table. But secondly, we have to understand this is not business. This is a different domain. It is way harder. It is much more nuanced. Everyone wants to pull at some magic lever. Oh, if we just get a Doge style unit, that'll work. No, right? In business, you have goal congruence. You have clarity. You often have single point objectives, whether it's sales, EBITDA, market share. Government isn't like that. It is all a trade-off. Do you invest in incubators or do you invest in elder people's care? And that does require a degree of persistence, endurance, nuance. By far the best way, and I don't think there is a substitute by just reaching for a bunch of, vibey business people and sprinkling them in, because I don't think that will subsist and endure, is actually to get people into the heart of government including in Parliament, which is where we have dispatch box accountability, and do it the hard way. I'd love it if there was a simple source you could just sprinkle. I actually think you need to go back to what we used to have, which is you had people of accomplishment sitting in the cabinet, representing business and understanding how it worked.
But I mean, you're a rare exception that's made that journey. I look at that journey, obviously thought about whether that's a journey I would take, and I look at it with fear rather than with opportunity. Why, running a top 200 UK business, stepping into an environment to go a long way backwards to potentially go forwards, but with no guarantees. As an environment, it's a difficult sell to business. So how do you entice people into that environment?
I think it's about the mission. I mean, people do that journey all the time. People go from big business to being an entrepreneur to a startup. You've got to have a sense of shared belief and mission. And one of the things that we've got back now is the sense that Parliament alone, it's not spread across Europe and Brussels or Strasbourg. Parliament is the sovereign body from which authority emanates. Secondly, you've got to believe in the team. You've got to believe that you're going to have leadership. You can't think that it's going to be a new leader rocking up every 18 months. Yep. That seems to me, necessary, but not of itself sufficient. Yep. So leadership, a team, someone you can follow, and then a certain degree of resilience to do it. But look, the next government is going to have the hardest challenge of our lives. Right, a wonderful challenge because we can get our country back. We can once again seek to be one of the most prosperous countries on the planet. We can attract people back who have left our country in the brain drain that's going on at the moment. Of course, it's going to be hard. But in my experience, good people don't shy away from hard. They don't want to bash their brains out on a system that is unresponsive. Yes. They want to be convinced that their efforts will actually result in change. And I think Kemi's doing a really good job of this, but if we can convince people that we've got the plans, that we are serious people, that we're willing to be honest about the trade-offs. No government has balanced its books for 26 years in this country. Right? That can't subsist. We can't keep on handing down. It's not a global issue. It's a G7 issue, if I'm honest. I mean, there's obviously headwinds for many economies, but there's a certain group of economies that are living beyond their means, that have an aging infrastructure and aging populations, and haven't really got to grips with how competitive the world is, with the exception of the US, which is the pace car. Most of the other exciting places on this planet that are growing really fast and delivering prosperity to their citizens are the UAEs, the Saudis, the Indonesias, the South Koreas, the Taiwans. And we could go through a big, long list of countries that arguably are doing a better job. Now, they're not all democratic, yes. And that is a challenge for those of us who believe ultimately you want to live in a democracy.
It's interesting to see what's happening in the UAE right now and this clampdown on influencers who have been very welcome there, but now in an environment where perhaps they're trying to protect the reputation of the country, that position's changed. So, it is a reminder that we are operating in different environments, but I have a lot of admiration for the ambition in the Middle East right now. Yeah. I look at the aspiration they have as an example in AI, and it's truly extraordinary. I mean, they're trying to reinvent their economy to be AI first. We'll come on to discuss AI in a short while. You were Economic Secretary of the Treasury. Today that's Lucy Rigby in that role, but it's an important role, represents the government's view into the city. If I look today, I see a couple of challenges. The first sits around our FinTech business, which is one of our darlings of the UK. So globally, we're absolutely a leader in FinTechs. We've some brilliant businesses that have been built like Revolut and Monzo. Starling and Oak North, a whole plethora of businesses, about 20 or so that we could name, over 100 fintechs of any scale that are being built at this moment. If I look at the scale of those organisations, there's about £500 billion of market capitalisation. Today, the FTSE 100 is only £2.5 trillion. So the ability to attract substantially more business into the UK economy, into the UK stock market, feels a real win for us. How do we incentivise those organisations to do that?
Love them, hug them close, not push them away. It was properly insane of the Treasury or financial regulators to be literally pushing away. I was advised not to meet Revolut. I went ahead anyway because it's the right thing. I would put statues of these sort of fintech founders and successes, and we could list many others, Wise as well. Yep. I'd put statues of them around the city in Parliament Square. We need to properly fall back in love with people who take risk and create wealth. And the whole financial regulatory system, in my humble opinion, having been city minister, the best job I did in government, because it was something that really mattered, and we had a plan, and we were getting on with something called the Mansion House reforms, which was 20 different reforms across all parts of the financial sector, from insurance to equities, to a culture of people going back and investing in stocks, having control of their own pension money, again, in a way that cuts out some of that disintermediation. But a lot of it is about risk. And if you have a financial system and incentives, and I'm afraid to say the tone at the top of regulators that is always about trying to extinguish risk, you won't create the opportunities here. And when people come to look at where they want to list, they can choose now in a way you couldn't choose when I was really in the public markets. But now you can choose all sorts of places around the world to list. You know, if you've got to wade through a whole barrage of ESG and diversity nonsense, and then you've got regulators who are risk averse, and it takes you 3 weeks rather than 3 days to clear your prospectus, and on, then sad to say, we're just not on the pace. Now, I think we can. I think the London market, has a great future ahead of us, but it's not going to happen without almost like a Big Bang 2, right? People forget. You're probably way too young as well, Steve, but Big Bang, was a huge thing for the City of London. And at the time, there were people that criticised, people that said it was the wrong thing to do. It shook up the old order. But in the decade following the Big Bang, the number of jobs in the City of London doubled. And it really pulled ahead. It became one of 2 global capital centres. I'm afraid it's time for something akin to that. You've got to have some discontinuity with this morass of regulation, more people in compliance than are actually fee earning in many of our businesses.
Yeah, 4 years to get a Revolut banking licence is really shameful. So
it's properly shameful. Heads should roll. Somewhere heads should roll for that. And the failure to land the arm float, which was, I lay firmly with the conduct of our regulators who weren't on the pace, weren't willing to step into that, I think has done real long-term damage to the UK capital markets. But I'm an optimist. We know what to do. We can fix it. But it is going to require change and a greater degree of change than I think we've seen hitherto.
So Mansion House, you mentioned there, Mansion House today, I'm pleased the government took forward the work that was undertaken on the previous administration. But today I think it's really focused on trying to incentivise pension funds to invest in startups and scale-ups. And that is one issue. There's no doubt that we have to be relevant about our size as a country. So, we are 9 times, the US is 9 times bigger than our economy. And actually, I think relatively we punch above our weight, to be honest with you, from a venture capital perspective. But we do need to put some more money into that area. But I do worry about the flows of capital into our core public companies. We've got an ever diminishing number of trading companies. There's a lot more funds. But if you break down the FTSE 100 and the FTSE 250, we're now down to about 250 trading companies across those 2 indices. So getting more pools of capital, which in turn gives greater valuations, which in turn gives more incentivization to be public rather than private equity or privately owned, has got to be part of the resolution. So how do we do that? Do we need to start talking to pension funds about taxation and incentivizing them to start investing their money more in the UK?
Look, as a small state conservative, my instinct isn't always to go to either more rules or more subsidies or fiscal nudges. Those are very legitimate areas to discuss with them. But I would start with trying to reverse the damage that has been done. So 2 things have really militated against the good old-fashioned UK asset management that did used to go and hunt out opportunities in the UK market. One was capping fees. The law we pass in Parliament most often is the law of unintended consequence. So something that's well-intentioned, let's cap the fees that people pay for the management.
It has second and third order consequences.
Yeah, and the second and third order consequences is everyone says, well, I'm just going to put my money in an index fund. I can't make money from going and doing the hard yards of hunting out where there's value, of doing that typically in my home market, because that's where I've got competitive advantage. I know we'll just put it into a global tracker. And where does the UK rank in that? A couple of percent percentage points of the overall global market. So first thing, deal with that issue of performance fees to go back to good old-fashioned UK asset management. The second thing, and we're getting a little bit technical here, but is this craven desire driven by the regulators for what's called liquidity. In all of the pension regulations, there's this desire for instant liquidity, which is one reason why there was this massive regulatory failure around what's called LDI, liability-driven investments, where your pension that could have been building bridges, supporting companies, helping people scale up, discovering the new life sciences technology that's going to make us all live twice as long, was instead sitting in a gilts portfolio, earning modest interest at very little risk, but in theory was available for daily liquidity. So the first thing I would fix is performance fees and that craven desire for liquidity, which even if the rule book doesn't always say that, the regulator, the traffic warden that comes in and looks at your portfolio holdings at the end of the month says, oh, that looks a bit risky. What are you doing investing in the next, Wegovy or something?
And obviously, when you're in opposition, you have more time to consider policy. When you're in government, you're running the country. So does Mel Stride and yourself, you're starting to now think through these policies. Obviously, you have 3.5 years out, potentially from an election campaign. But as you start to think about what the manifesto shapes up to be, are these the policies you're starting to think about today?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of that is unfinished business. I mean, one of the features of most of the shadow cabinet, if you like, is we were sort of the middle-ranking ministers. We've got enough experience of government to know how it's plumbed, which bits you need to, whether you cut the red wire or the blue wire to make something go different without it banging too much, and how to properly address some of the challenges that we knew we faced even then. So on city reform, for example, it's not the direction of travel, which, as you say, Lucy Rigby and other city ministers have carried on. To me, it's the pace. Because if you just carry on in a sort of linear fashion and the world is changing exponentially, you'll never catch up. Yes. And so a lot of it is hitting the ground running, making plans in opposition so you can go in on day one and bang, 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 bang. These are all of the changes and policies that you're going to do. That work is going on right now. There's good opportunities for people like yourself and other groups to feed into that and say, if it were you, these would be the big things that make a big difference rather than getting bogged down in the small stuff.
Yeah. So one of the policies that I know you feel very passionately about is the Employment Rights Bill. And without making this too political, you have the benefit of talking to lots of businesses about this particular issue. What are your fears as these changes start to come in the next couple of years? What are your fears? What are you hearing from business around the Employment Rights Bill?
My first fear, as a patriot, is that businesses themselves don't understand this enough. And this is the biggest change in employment law, which almost every business has, big and small. They're all engaged in employing people. The biggest change in employment law for 40 years. So the first thing I always say to businesses, Steve, is look, get yourself advised on this. Go to your HR or lawyer and make sure you fully understand the consequences. The second thing I worry about, again, acutely as a patriot, is what it's going to do for the opportunities of young people. Right, the flywheel, don't want to get too big here, too heavy, but the flywheel of popular capitalist democracy is that your children and grandchildren, in return for you ceding some autonomy to the state, have a more prosperous and safer life. Mm-hmm. And if that compact fails, you see what I would argue is happening across Western Europe, which is people go to the extremes. They go to the radical Marxist Greens, or they go to parties on the populist right, rather than the centre. And I don't think that is particularly healthy for democracy. 1 in 6 young people now in this country are unemployed. That's to say they are actively looking for a job. They're not in employment. They're not in training. They're actively looking for a job and they cannot find one. That's arguably before most of the impact of AI hits. It's a unique UK phenomena. We're now, for the first time in our lives, we have higher youth unemployment than the EU average. Mm-hmm. That's never been the case. I used to employ people across many European markets, and it was well known that they were difficult markets. Mm-hmm. The employment
Spain and Italy.
Spain and Italy and Germany. Yes. In Germany, you could never let anyone go. It was 4 years if you needed to let someone go, 4 years worth of pay. So that was always a challenge. So this is now coming at us. I do think it's completely the wrong intervention at this time. We should be looking to liberalise the employment market. Our policy will be to reverse almost all of the changes in that job-destroying bill. There's a few things that were uncontroversial, like leave for parents who'd suffered miscarriage. I mean, any good employer would have done that anyway. No problem with putting that on a statutory footing. But it's 330 pages long. It's not what employers need. We've got a real problem with getting young people into work. It hits things like seasonality and flexible working. It makes the role of the employment tribunals much worse, and they're already in a really bad state. And there's this new regulator, right? There's added red tape regulator called the Fair Work Agency that again is going to sort of come around and make itself busy poking into generally uncontentious relations between workers and employers.
What's your view of the low paid commission? So it operates in theory outside of government control, and in September 2024 there I think was a government directive to change from 60% of medium salary for minimum wage to 65%. It happened at the same time national insurance rises occurred, and it happened at the same time that the thresholds changed. That pushed the cost of employing people up very, very substantially, over 10% in that period, which largely we're now starting to feel the ramifications in the hospitality and retail sector of those decisions. Should the Low Pay Commission sit as a independent body? Should it form part of the centre of government? What is your take there?
I think in general there are too many what's called arm's length bodies, and they've lost. It was a historical thing. Some people wanted to put them outside of government in the belief that that would give that independence and perhaps bring other voices in. But the flip side is ultimately it's government that owns the growth. And if you are in an arm's length body, you can be fairly indifferent about the consequences, whether you're an environment regulator or a low pay commission. You don't feel the pain if the economy doesn't grow. You've done your little bit of that. So I would bring, and the Conservative Party would bring, much more of those control back into government and hold people to account. If you don't like the decisions, you know exactly where responsibility lies. Just in your organisation, ultimately, it's Steve that's calling the shots, and that should be ministerial accountability. I'd rename it, to be quite honest, because if you call it low pay commission, it's sort of leading the witness.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're going to have a state set, national set of wages, and there's a debate about, whether that's a good outcome or not, but if you're going to have that, it should certainly have regard to things like the level of unemployment, the competitiveness
economic conditions,
of UK conditions.
Yeah. If we turn to AI, there's a recent survey in the US where there's a lot of public pushback on AI. But whether people like it or not, it's coming. Even if the workforce and the consumer don't want that rate of change to happen, it's coming our way. This does have the possibility to fix the productivity puzzle in the UK. So it has the ability to break through. Since 2016, as you know, we've had no productivity growth in this country. How do we adapt in the future, in your opinion?
Well, I think you put it really well, and it seems to me the delta now is enormous. It's like all the different changes on steroids. So either you go forward, you turn it into a productivity tool, you upskill your entire workforce and economy and embrace that, or there will be countries and nations that don't do that, that try and put their heads in the sand, and that will make them fall further behind. So I think we've got to do the former. Sky, we always said, you've got to disrupt yourself, right? That's the way to long-term success. Work out how someone would attack you and then do that to yourself so that you've taken out any points of weakness. It was the old Andy Grove, only the paranoid survive mantra. And that worked. I mean, we transitioned from analog technology to digital, to streaming, to all sorts of other things along the way, but always by being brave. So if you don't know if you're in business and you don't know exactly what the world holds, I would say you do two things. You invest in radars, what is your forward-looking visibility to see what's out there and experiment and take risk and try and innovate. And secondly, you try and make your business more agile in its factors of production, make them more agile and upskill. That means often upskilling as well. From a country economy level conversation, exactly the same. Let's make AI ubiquitous as a tool for young people who are going through the education system. So a little bit like the internet or digital technology generally, it just becomes a productivity technology that is ubiquitous.
One of the interesting things about AI is that we've been reliant on immigration as a country for some time, and with a falling population, as most developed economies have, we've probably no choice if we want to sustain our economy but to continue having immigration. I think the forecast is 300,000 people a year needed from 2035. AI can stop that if we want to. So we can have an environment where the population can remain at around 70 million people, and we can still grow our economy. Our productivity can be resolved. So it feels like one of the most important consequential issues in the government today, but I fear it's very performative today.
Well, it's
I
certainly
think
not
we're
going to be
saying-
fixed by a speech, is it? Right?
No.
I mean, I've seen all sorts of people give all sorts of speeches about AI. Nor do I think the world's, being the world's most secure, country and building walls against AI is the way to go either. So it has to be actions, not words.
Yes.
It can't just be another speech or even just like another institute. Fine, let's have some of those things, but it's really deploying it. It's
gonna
plumbing
require
it into
proper
the
investment.
heart of the system. Backing that up all the way through government, not just making a nice speech.
So Andrew, I know you've got 5 visions that you see for how we change the country. Just step us through those if you could do.
Yeah, look, for business, what I would say is cheaper energy. We can't compete on the basis of having more expensive energy than almost anywhere in the world. Lower and simpler tax, again, to make ourselves more competitive, particularly against the G20, not the G7. The G20, they're the fast chasing pack that we need to compete with. Cut red tape, proper reduction in the volume of red tape, but also the size of regulators that administer that. And then return to a flexible labour market, as we've talked about. And then the fifth, Steve, that I think is most important, really, it's a cultural piece. As a country, we've got to fall back in love with wealth creators. We've got to brain drain. We're driving them away, the vibe towards people that take risk and create wealth, even like yourself, family businesses, a government that is imposing a family business death tax. So I think culturally, we've got to recognise that if we want to compete, we want to be prosperous, we want jobs for our children and grandchildren, then there's a really important role of private businesses.
Just pick up on a few of those points. So in terms of celebrating wealth creation, 1% of the population, 350,000 working people, provide 27% of the taxation. So a huge concentration. You and I both are meeting people and organisations that represent family offices or significant families. And we know that, whilst the statistics of 16,000 people leaving a year may not be 100% accurate, the momentum is for people to leave the UK. That can't be the answer. So just taxing those people to extinction cannot be the answer. We end up, the whole country may well be a little bit fairer, but it's going to be poorer for everybody. Everybody's in a worse position. So I know you feel quite strongly about non-doms. So just give a little bit of you there, if you could do, please.
Well, it's the same. It's exactly the same point, which is these are people who've got a choice of anywhere in the world, and by definition, they're not having to be anchored in the UK. And most of them pay their way. They pay their taxes here. They consume here. They're investing in the UK, often very, very significant amounts of money. And yet the government's policy has been to force them against their will. I mean, a lot of them have said, and they'll say that to you as well, look, I didn't want to leave the UK. I've even kept things here. But if the UK is going to attack my global assets that were never made in the UK, maybe have existed even before I came here, but is going to put its clutches into the UK's very high rate of inheritance tax, much higher than most other countries, then we are forcing them to leave. And you know what? If you don't care about non-doms, or you got some very dogmatic ideological view against them, worry about the young people. Worry about the fact that the fastest growing number of people who are leaving our country are between the age of 16 and 35, the bright, ambitious people who could be creating companies and startups and scale-ups, but they're choosing to do so elsewhere because of the vibe against people who are risk-taking and wealth creators.
Yeah, I think we somehow have to stop the momentum. So, this is a real issue. Today, we're both in our mid-50s. Once your children are grown up, you do have flexibility. Historically, you went to Monaco or went to Geneva, neither of which particularly were attractive places for people to go and live. But today you can go to Malta or to Athens or to Milan. There are so many places now that people can go. And importantly, people choose to live in multiple locations when they leave rather than a single location. And this misunderstanding around, the fact that we have a mobile elite, if you like, in the country, we've got to understand that now. They have to pay their fair dues. As you know, I'm a significant UK taxpayer, very proud of doing that. I believe tax is a force for good. I also believe people living here need to pay into the system. But that can be done by a different mechanism. It shouldn't necessarily by penalising their wealth, but it should be by significant annual fees.
Correct.
And as you know, we haven't resolve that issue in the UK, despite other very good examples around the world.
We will have a very competitive offering, both in terms of how the tax system treats people fairly, but also investment visas for people who want to come here and put their risk capital here. It could be part of the answer as to how we get people back investing in stock market or British companies. So we will have those things, and then the UK will compete on its formidable natural advantages. They're just, this city, there's nowhere as good on the planet. London on a good day, Britain on a good day.
It's amazing.
Our universities, our language, our culture, our creativity, our architecture, our heritage, all of these wonderful things. So we can compete, but it's got to start from a determination that is the right basis on which to build a global economy.
Just talking a bit more about tax. So under the Conservatives, and this isn't an accusation because it's really Treasury, and Treasury, operates, through varying government organisations. The tax code went from 17,000 pages to 25,000 pages. It's set under this administration to continue to grow. It's the longest tax code in the G20, highly complicated to unravel at this point. But tax simplification feels like a really important thing to do. If I look at myself, do I take money out via PAYE? Do I take it out via dividend? Do I try and get capital gains tax? Surely there should be a simpler route for a businessman, as an example, or woman to be taxed in the UK. So in your opinion, how do we go about thinking about tax simplification? How long is that journey? Can we make rapid progress? And importantly, can we provide more incentivisation in the process to create more wealth for the country?
The UK tax code is insane. It is indefensible. That level of 25,000 pages. Last week we passed the Finance Act. Just 1 year's worth of changes as a result of the Chancellor's budget was 550 pages alone. It's just, we just keep heaping more and more on. It's like a teenager's bedroom carpet floor. You can't see the original pattern because there's so many different things piled on top. I'm a big fan of Nigel Lawson. He was one of those people that brought me into politics, or inspired me into politics. And he did change and he did simplify. So yes, lower taxes we all want, but even aside from lower taxes, which cost money and there's trade-offs, there's rampant simplification. What we've seen over years is often politicians, playing a distraction game of saying, well, we'll lower this headline rate over here, but by the way, we're going to end up with all these extra stealth taxes. Still at it, the packaging tax, the sugar tax, taxes on insurance. When we tax things, like we put up the tax on alcohol because we don't want people to drink more, but we're very happy as a state to put up the tax on labour and employment and business and the high street business rates when we want more of when we actually we need to be protecting our high streets. So there's lots of work to do there. I'm very pleased that one of the first pledges the Conservatives have made is to scrap stamp duty on all primary residences, downsizers, first-time buyers, everybody, because that again is one of those friction taxes that distorts. Mm-hmm. It's a move towards simplification, because if you had a world where there was no stamp duty, and if you had a world where there was no inheritance tax, a lot of these other complications would drop away as well. Now I'm not saying that's where we are right now, but there's work going on. And if you think about pensions, there's a live debate about bringing pensions into inheritance tax. The only reason we're having that is because there's an inheritance tax in the first place. We're relatively unusual in the UK about the level and the rate of inheritance. Most countries don't have anything like as invasive a system.
Mm. One of the challenges we're facing today, obviously, with this latest conflict in Iran, is a very unsettled world. And it feels as unsettled today as I've known in my lifetime. And, I'm starting to talk to my wife about, do we need contingency plans? Whatever those might be, whether that's generators at home or whether it's store of petrol, and you start thinking that way, and it's got to be negative for the country and for the world that you're starting to think in that manner. It's clear, we've had a defence environment where we're under pressure. We have a nuclear deterrent, which is a very meaningful cost for the country. We've a very substantial pension liability sat in the armed forces, which takes up a large amount of our budget, and it leaves an ever-reducing size of budget at an environment where we've got to modernise warfare. It's clear, that AI and physical AI is going to play an important role. We've seen that clearly in the Ukraine war. How do we get through the issue that we have today on defence spending when there are so many other pressures that the country faces? Do we need to start considering things like war bonds? Is there a different route that you think we should be taking there?
Well, it starts with an honesty. It starts with an honesty about what we've got, not pretending that we've got capabilities that we haven't. You've seen that with things like recently the Navy and our inability to actually put vessels where people would wish they would be to protect our assets in Cyprus. So it starts with that honesty. I think it's always useful, and people don't always understand big numbers, but it's useful to contextualize. We're not, although we spend a lot on defence, we spend almost twice that amount on interest on our borrowings alone. And we spend, by the end of this Parliament, 7 or 8 or 9 times on welfare than we're currently spending on defence. Now, that can't subsist. We have to make those choices. It's all too easy to think you can just add that to the national debt and pass that down. I'm personally not a huge fan of war bonds. I've seen various different iterations, but gilts already have some tax exemptions already. The gilts being, government borrowing money and printing money for the future. And we are pretty close to the edge of the frontier, the very tolerance of the markets on gilts. So, yes, you could talk about a little bit more borrowing, and that's what the Germans have done to rearm, but we're starting from a higher base anyway. So, look, I was a finance director for 12 years. You don't become wildly popular as a finance director. You've probably got one. And even you probably rail against being told, well, we haven't got that money, Steve, and, we need to spend a little bit less on marketing. We need to cut our cloth according to our means.
And so you'd fund it through welfare?
Well, I think welfare is where we've looked to fund the various things that we've already pledged. And I think that's the big conversation that the government, the state, needs to have with the citizens. We are living beyond our means. It is, as you say, a volatile and dangerous world. You would be brave to assume that everything just goes back nicely into its box after the Gulf and Ukraine. And therefore, we need to invest in defence. Invest in what I would call domestic resilience. It's quite scary how fragile things like our telecoms networks, our payment systems are. I think we need to be a lot more clear-eyed about the risks, cyber, but other risks, and energy, obviously. And that's going to cost money, and we're going to have to make some choices.
So talking about welfare, the bill today is about 330 billion this year, forecast by 2030 to be 400 billion. It's made up of a large number of issues. Obviously, pensions make a very large element of that. And we've got things like triple lock, which, I think everybody would agree isn't necessarily fair. We don't treat our teachers and our nurses that way. But no one wants to tackle because pensioners are important voters. So do we need an approach on welfare where it's a cross-party debate rather than just the governing party? Because the challenges we face on welfare feel the most important issues to tackle today. They're going to take many years to resolve. We can't clearly change people's welfare benefits overnight. We've got to transition people to work from sickness back into the workplace. Is that an issue that one party can tackle on its own in government, or do we need a cross-party approach?
Well, I'd like the latter, but I don't think that's going to happen, unfortunately. You've got one party who disproportionately represents people on welfare, a party that has no representation of business and the private sector, and a party that is willing to make those hard choices and trade-offs. So I think we're going to have to do the hard yards as the main economically literate centre-right party. We've already started that by talking about trade-offs, about talking about the welfare reform that we would deploy. A good example of that is the debate around the 2-child benefit cap. Right now, we need more children, but if you and I, if someone comes to you, Steve, you're a very generous employer, I hear nothing but good things about you, but if someone comes along and says, look, I've just had another child, you might give them a voucher for a weekend to take their wife away or some flowers. You don't immediately increase their salary. That's the world of the private sector. That's the world of hard choices. Even that slither of reform on welfare, where there could have been a cross-party consensus, because we would have supported the government on that, fell over. So I fear that we're going to look in vain for that consensus that would always be desirable. We're going to have to level with the British people that hard choices are coming, and say where our values are, the values of people who are hard work and trying to rely on themselves. Doesn't mean there's not a safety net, but the safety net has got wildly out of control with 6 million people of working age who are not in work. They're on benefits. Some people are on benefits from the age of 20 to the entirety of
It's
their
multi-generational
life.
In some environments.
Correct. And it's not fair on them either. It's not a good outcome for them and their children. So we believe in work, and we're willing to make the tough choices around that.
Mm-hmm. Over 14 years, the Conservatives didn't change a lot in welfare. So what's different next time around? So you clearly were in power for a long period of time, part of it in coalition, but these difficult decisions weren't faced then. Why should the public trust that they're going to be faced next time around?
Plans and a team that are united, simplistically. If you make the plans, you think them through in outside of the challenges of day-to-day governing. And then you've got a team that is consistently united behind that. And that was an issue in the 2019 government, that people did come up with sensible plans, but partly due to the social dynamics of COVID, the lockdowns, and all of the headwinds that government faced, it found it hard, even with an 80-seat majority, to get its programme through. This government, the same. The answer to that, to me, is have good, proper Conservatives standing for Parliament. So you've got goal alignment, the sort of thing you have in any organisation. And then you've got good plans so that in that interval, before events blow you off course, you can actually deploy those and land those reforms.
So looking forward, we've got polls today showing Labour, the Conservatives and the Greens broadly in the same place together. Lib Dems a little bit further behind, Reform a little bit further ahead. Is the two-party system dead, or do you still see a two-party system moving forward?
Look, I'm not a commentator. I want a good government with a healthy majority to get things done. I think that's a strength of the UK system when it works. I think the next election will be an election about the economy. I think ultimately people will start to see in their lives the fact that they are not getting more prosperous. Their children can't get work, or they can't get work at the sort of level that they aspire to, that ultimately they need a government that's willing to make the hard choices. If you like, it's not like a great virtue, but sometimes when times are tough, you do send for the sort of the bank manager type that is going to do the things that are good for you and deliver good outcomes. And I think that's a good positioning for the Conservatives. We're not always the most loved party, but we can be respected, and we can be the party that tells the truth. So that's kind of how I think about it. I'm not the best politician in the world. I've only done this for 6 years, so I don't know what happens to the multi-party system. I know that people out there are frustrated. I know they're grumpy. They feel that the system doesn't work for them, and in some cases that is absolutely right. But I think a set of credible people willing to work as a team and with a coherent plan is always attractive, and no more so when the chips are down.
I think the simple issue today is that people need to see a growing economy. And I've got 8 businesses here in the UK, 7 of which are having a more difficult time than they were a year ago. And the simple issue is our growth is very low and our cost base is very high. It's squeezing profit in the middle. When profit squeezes, you know from your own experience in Sky, you start to consider structure of organisations, you start to consider capital expenditure, you consider cash flow, and all of those decisions are negative decisions, really, rather than looking forward in your business. So I think the difference between 2% growth in the economy in business feels like 10%.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, the consumer has a little bit more money. Most people are living, on a very tight budget, and that includes not just people on lower salaries. Also, I think middle income earners are also living on a very tight salary, and in their environment, they also need hope. How do we break through, do you think, on this growth position? We just printed 0% growth in January. Through no fault of this government, we're at war in Iran. And that's going to have material consequences to the economy for March and probably for the next few months forward. If that lasts and persists for a long period of time, for the whole year, it may push the world into recession. It has a reasonable likelihood of pushing the UK into recession. What do we do to change that?
Stop digging. I mean, in a world, we're trying to get our mojo back. And if every time there's a budget or a statement, it's about, I'm going to take a bit of your pension, I'm going to introduce a new tax on your house, I'm going to make it harder for you to employ people. If that's the vibe that's constantly happening, and by the way, you don't see suddenly the public services getting transformationally better because that money's just going into public sector salaries. It's not delivering more operations or faster roads or anything like that. That's a very hard vibe to reverse. So the first thing you do is stop digging. And I think I'm not here to praise or damn anybody, but it was good that the spring statement didn't come forward
Agreed.
with another blizzard of measures, because businesses I speak to we just want a bit of stability. We're pragmatic people. We can absorb some of these shocks. The fact that they're all coming in a cacophony, a lot of them now will come on the 1st of April, just days away now, is not helpful. But we're pragmatic. Business has this ferocious problem-solving power. We can compete on our strengths, but just stop the adversity. And so that's the first thing that you have to do. Then you need to be positive about the vision for our country. I try and be positive. I'm not just here to oppose. The country has wonderful natural strengths. The more you squeeze the spring, the quicker it will bounce back. So I think you want a government that feels like it's positive and leading us in a good direction. And then level with people. Just, we know, right? We're going to have to probably tighten our belts because energy costs is embedded in lots of things. But if you level with people and you're not simultaneously squandering money and wasting money so that they can say, well, you're asking me to make a sacrifice over here, but over there, somebody else isn't, and they're having money squandered on them, then you don't have that national solidarity to get through a crisis. It's not about spraying money at the wall, but it's about that genuine sense of us being in it together. But that also includes government tightening its belt as well.
Good. Well, as you know, on this podcast, we give a charitable donation. So can you perhaps just talk us through the charity you've chosen for today?
Yeah, it's a local charity in my constituency, my district. It's Sussex Snowdrop Trust. They help children with incurable diseases, try and make their lives as bearable as possible. It's a voluntary charity, like a lot of charities like that. It doesn't have a lot of resources. I try and support various local charities, and you've very kindly agreed to support the Sussex Snowdrop Trust.
Great. Well, we're called the Policy Fix. I can't let you leave today without one request for a single policy that's top of your mind that you would change.
Oh, my goodness. There's so many. You get buried in the bowels of Whitehall. I think if there was a single thing, it's not necessarily a policy, it is this sense of falling back in love with risk and wealth creators. It just from a primary school doing risk assessments that destroy the voluntary impulse of people wanting to go and take young kids on a school trip or have speakers into schools, all the way up to the commanding heights of the Bank of England not giving Revolut a license. I just think we've lost our mojo on taking risk. And this is a fantastic country. We built empires, we've built bridges around the world. Young people used to sail literally off the cliffs, off what they thought were the edge of, a flat world and oceans to build the planet that we've got today. Let's just get back to a little bit more of that.
I think from my side, if I look at Treasury, they really only sell two things, carrots and sticks. And carrots are there to incentivise and grow the country. The sticks are there to fund the country. They're there to tax,
you think there's quite a lot of sticks and not enough carrots.
Yeah, my single policy fix is that we need to get back to a balance between the two. Of course, we need to raise taxation. We have to face the reality it's heading to 40%. It has to get there before it can fall. I'm fully paid up for that journey because the train has left the station. But the sticks can only go so far. We've got to think about more carrots. We've got to think about how do we incentivise growth, not penalise growth. And I think that mindset shift, we've got 7 months until the next budget. Certainly I continue to lobby Treasury to really start thinking about how do we find more ways to incentivise wealth creation.
Yeah, well, let's unite that thought with the idea of a government that if you're in business, if you're a wealth creator, if you're a risk taker, we have a government that's got your back.
So, Andrew, a few quick-fire questions. If there was one Labour Member of Parliament that you could poach, who would it be?
Whoa, God, that's a difficult question. Carl Turner at the moment, he's leading the revolt, if you like, to protect jury trials. And that's brave. It's brave to be a rebel, and it's something I agree with.
So who's the more ruthless, do you think? The Murdochs or the Westminster Society?
I mean, Westminster infinitely worse, in truth. With the Murdochs is about performance and creating environments in which people can do their very best work. In Westminster, there's a sense, particularly amongst maybe some of the media, that it's always about bringing people down, taking them down.
Who runs the country in your mind? Is that the ministers or is it the civil service?
It's the ministers, and do not let them off the hook. There's a big sort of vibe about, attacking civil servants. Yes, you would change certainly the performance incentives, the way you measure them, the accountability of civil servants. But don't let the ministers off the hook. They could do a lot better job of leadership, setting clear goals, chasing progress, and all of the things that you would do every day naturally in business, Steve. I used to do in business, and not every minister, let's just say, is as good as they should be on that.
So, Andy, you're back in power. By some miracle, you find £10 billion of additional firepower. What's the one thing you do to put that to work?
I'd give it back to the people it came from. So taxpayers, it's their money. And in terms of the choices, I would love to see us reduce the rate of inheritance tax. It's very distortive and undermines incentives. But also I'd like to do something for the very smallest businesses, reduce the burden of tax on them, because it's hard when they're fragile and starting out.
Yeah. Andrew, thanks for your time today. Great to see you.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for everything you do as well. It's a great voice for business in Whitehall and Westminster and at the very top of government.
Thank you, Andrew. So I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you'd like to see more episodes of The Policy Fix, please click here.